going to jump right into it this week because I did all kinds of weird stuff while working on this. The first of which being I made a blank temporary piece to be cast using nothing but foam core. What you can see here is the stripped away foam core, which I very carefully bent into shape to make little inner walls, which will all come together and make sense once we go along. But this part ended up being a little bit ugly, but that's fine because I only really needed one casting off it, so it's a little wasteful. But the very bottom part is what ends up showing, and that ends up being flush with the top of the mold, so it comes out more or less level. So that's what I did there. It's pretty simple and straightforward, and like I said, this will make more sense as we go along. Made another mold, used a little gap ring to keep it from wasting too much material, of course. And then here we're going to switch over, and you can kind of see that as I'm tearing it away, I'm actually ripping off pieces of the mold itself, because I don't need to save this piece. It's a one-off thing. Now that I have the mold, I have all the stuff I need to, use this properly. So the blank, the original, doesn't matter so much. And in terms of mold making and prop making, this can be a consideration you can kind of keep in mind, that the piece you're working on, if it's going to be molded, that is, doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to even necessarily be pretty, because you're going to be cleaning it up, sanding it down, painting it, doing all this other stuff to, as I say, hide your crimes. Now, even though I only needed one of these particular pieces, we could say I was thinking ahead and, understanding that I might make more of these in the future, and I might. This is also a very labor-intensive project, and we'll see how that turns out. But having this mold also means, as long as it turns out alright, that is, it means I can remake this part in the event that it breaks, or that something goes horribly wrong, that I sand it down too much and make it too small, or make it so it doesn't fit. It gives me a little extra wiggle room to go and make some mistakes. Fortunately, though, I did only really need one of these things, and adding that little extra bit of wire in there to give it some extra strength ended up helping me out a bit. So I'm just gonna zip ahead to pulling this out from the mold then. I ended up putting this in the description of the last video, but I kind of felt like I was spending a little too much time on the mold making process, which kind of makes for repetitive videos. So if you're not entirely sure on some of the stuff I'm doing, go back and watch some of my other older videos where I more or less get into the whole mold making and casting process. Now, one thing I do want to point out here, which is kind of interesting, and it was on purpose, because I cast this, or rather made the mold around sort of the raw texture of the foam core foam, this ended up giving the piece the same texture because the silicone picks that up. And this is actually a good thing, because that gives me something that's a little bit more substantial for glues and stuff to grip onto, which is a good thing when it's going to come time to assemble this whole thing. You do want something of a grippier texture when it comes to joining surfaces like that. So once I had that all figured out and had that all squared away, what actually surprised me and might surprise you is this whole thing came together very nicely. It needed very little adjustment and very little sanding before all of the pieces just sort of snapped into place. Now, as you can kind of see, I put a little lip on each of those spokes on the cage, the little up and down bits, and what that does is when you pull, or rather when I pull that topmost ring up into place, it sort of locks it there, because given the way this lantern's going to sit, it's going to be hanging down kind of off itself. So you want all of that sort of weight to secure itself in place, and that's why I built this sort of uppermost ring to lock around those. And like I said, it was just my good fortune that I had everything measured out and sanded down enough that it needed very little in the way of additional work after coming straight out of the mold to fit it into place. I just kind of ran that large file there through each of those slots, and it just popped right into place. Since I had several more pieces to build, I was kind of jumping back and forth between a lot of these. And one of the things I wanted to start working on next was the lid, which, oddly enough, I just sort of skipped the middle of the lantern and jumped straight to the top, just because I felt like doing a little bit of foam smithing. And I'd like to say that this was purely because I wanted to demonstrate some of these techniques, but I just kind of have a bad habit of doing whatever seems to feel right at the time, even if it's not necessarily the best technique. For my own sake, I'm just going to say that's part of my creative process. So, if you're unfamiliar with foam smithing, the most common technique is to use barge contact cement or other brushable contact cement to add a thin layer to both surfaces of what you're joining, and then, well, let it dry for about 5 to 10 minutes, then go back in and smush it together onto what you're working on. So nothing I did here was too crazy, other than using that little plastic ring spacer to make sure I had the right height, or at least the minimum amount of height that I would need to build this thing. That little bit of purple foam in there I made a little bit wider at the top, like a little bit more mushroomy, just because I knew that I was going to be sanding down or dremeling down into those layers, and so I wanted to have a little bit more material instead of kind of ending up with a gap in there. And the dremeling process isn't anything all that special. You just kind of very carefully work it down and make sure not to bite into it too much, because it's very easy to just press it in there with a very low amount of force and bite a chunk out of the piece you're working on. But between that and using a sanding block to touch it up, I kind of got it to the shape I wanted, but the thickness wasn't quite right. I'll say off camera I ended up adding a second layer of the thin black foam. It's about 2mm foam. Added that around there to bulk it out and then work it down into more of a chamfered edge on that top bit. But then I want to switch gears here again and just realize it's a bad pun. I'm not doing a gear grinder pun. That's not intentional, I'm sorry. But we're gonna switch up to something else really quick. So, after taking the time to get that all sanded and shaped the way I wanted, I started putting a layer of Elmer's Wood Glue Max around this thing. And a lot of the foamsmith type prop makers, armor makers, like to seal their pieces with stuff like Plastidip or other spray-on rubber coatings that seal things up really well. There's other materials to use too, but Plastidip seems to be pretty popular. PVA glues are fairly popular too. I tend to like wood glue because in my little experimentation with foam smithing, I found that the Wood Glue Max specifically has a quality that fills in gaps and sort of spaces between joined layers fairly nicely. And in addition to that, this is also just my experience, Wood Glue Max tends to dry, like when it's fully cured, it gives you a solid, semi-rigid finish that does have a little bit of flex to it, which is nice for various reasons, for durability, but it's also something that you can sand and kind of keep a little bit of texture on. And I think that might come in handy with some of the stuff I'm going to be doing later. But what you're just seeing here is me applying a layer of the wood glue. Now, one of the downsides to working with wood glue is that it can take about 24 hours to fully cure. And when you need to be sanding and prepping and working on as many pieces as possible and getting stuff done, that can be bad. So hitting it with a heat gun does work, and it will cause the outer layer to dry a little bit more quickly, which makes it easier to handle. But there are risks, and I do have a little bit of footage here, so let me switch that up and show you what happens, or what can happen if you abuse a heat gun with wood glue. As I said just a couple moments ago, really, when you hit it with the heat gun, it will cure the outer layer. But what can end up happening, especially if you leave the heat gun on it for too long, is it will start to cook that outer layer, and it'll burn a little bit, but it'll also start creating air bubbles. And that can be very bad, as that will more or less completely ruin the texture in an area. And that will either force you to strip that layer off, start from scratch, or just live with the fact that you've got a bubbly, uneven texture on your piece. It's not something you want. So this was something that came to mind while I was working, and I felt like it was worth mentioning. If you can be a little bit more patient, and if you can afford to be patient, wood glue will more or less dry and be good to sand within an hour or two after applying. Especially if you're doing what I'm doing, where you're doing thin layers and then spreading it around to create an even texture on your piece. It'll definitely dry much faster than 24 hours. But let's keep things moving along. To create that sort of main bulk of the upper ring / cap of the Scoutfly lantern, I just went ahead and made a cylinder of cardstock, and then created a second cylinder around that to give it a kind of a sturdy shape. Cut off a slice of white 2mm craft foam on there to be sort of one more extra layer. But I use the craft foam specifically because this part of the lantern has almost sort of a leathery texture when you look at reference. And this is something that you kind of learn by taking the time to get as much reference imagery as you can, so you can notice those little details and the little things that may have slipped by you or been easily misinterpreted by your eye just by watching it normally. One of the things I did to add in one more of the sort of detail lines into the leathery part was the very basic and very common technique of scoring the material by putting an ever so faint line, not all the way through it, but just through the surface, and then hitting that with a heat gun to cause it to sort of open up and become a little bit more visible. It should show up fairly well on camera, but you can even see just as the heat gun's running across it, that faint little line gets much darker, and also the edges get a little bit warped, but that's not a big deal. Now what I'm doing here is a technique I picked up from watching Evil Ted's videos. If you haven't watched any of his stuff, go watch his stuff. He's a really, really talented foamsmith, and he's a guy who's been in the biz of prop making and movie production for a very long time. He has a lot of great information. But one of the things he did a video on not too far back was creating a leathery texture in EVA foam by heating it up and then hitting it with a little bit of tin foil, because it causes it to more easily pick up that texture. And then when you go into paint it and detail it and make it look all fancy, that little bit of texture will pop a lot more, and it'll give you a much more sort of authentic leathery feel. But even though I intended to, still intend to make a mold out of this, this is more or less just a piece to be molded. I wanted that texture to be in there because the silicone will pick that up. I said that even in this video, the silicone does pick up every little bit of texture and detail. So it's worth it to try and get it in there just to see if that'll transfer over and show up in the final product. But with that part done, I did the same as before, put a little contact cement on there, let it dry, and then attach that to the final piece. And contact cement is just as good for attaching foam to foam as it is to attach foam to cardstock in this case. A little later on, what I ended up doing was adding another ring of craft foam to the inner diameter of the Scoutfly lid, I guess I'm going to call it. And this was just to give it both a little bit more thickness, but also to create sort of a gasket for the very top of the lid to settle into. And that'll all make sense once I show you how this has all come together. But in this case, I just ended up using Turbo Tacky Glue, which is just a very basic craft glue, But by this point, I realized I'd been wasting a lot of time and not making a lot of progress. And the lesson I had tried to convey earlier was really getting into my head, which was these pieces don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be structurally sound. Well, maybe not. They do need to be structurally sound, but they don't need to be absolutely pretty, because in the mold making process, I will lose certain details, as in like the bottom edge where this is connected doesn't need to be perfectly pretty or sealed up or everything, and certain other qualities don't need to be fully sealed up and prepped as if I were going to paint them and sand them and do all kinds of stuff to them, because I will have the opportunity to do that later once I have this all set up. So I went ahead and just used tacky glue because that worked just fine. Since the video is getting a little bit long at this point, though, I'm just going to clip ahead here and give you the short version of some of the things I did. Like the top of the lid there is made with layers of craft foam and foam core poster board, then wrapped in a layer of cardstock and then sanded down. If you're thinking it's a little weird to sand things that aren't wood, you can sand just about anything. In fact, it's maybe something that's best to get into your head that just about everything can be sanded, and probably should. I've seen a lot of props and costumes and stuff that could really benefit from a bit of sanding. Now, those little googly eyes you're seeing on the lid there are there on purpose. They act as rivets, and this is actually a trick I've seen a lot of prop makers do, and it's a nice trick at that. But they have just kind of the right size and shape and curvature to visually read as rivets once they've been painted over. So that's something to keep in mind if you are trying to sort of achieve that without having to make lots of little fiddly bits and then, you know, kind of glue them into place or whatever. But with things as they are right now, and you can see I'm making a little dummy one just to give you an idea of how it'll look. The only parts I need to make are sort of that inner rod of the lantern that lights up, and I guess I'm going to have to do something with LEDs at some point, so I'm going to have to pick some of those up. But I have to do that bit, and then I have to make a little hinge, a clip of some kind, for it to go on the belt. And then I think the only other detail I need to do is the stitching, because there's a ring of stitching that goes around the outer edge of the top of the Scoutfly lantern that I think I can probably get in there with a bit of molding. Like when I go to pour the silicone, if that's in there, it'll definitely pick up, and I think it should look alright. But that's something to consider for the future. But as things are right now, this thing's probably a good like 75% done. I'm just going to have to buy a lot of silicone. And unfortunately, silicone is priced by volume and not necessarily by complexity of mold, which makes things a little bit more difficult for me. I think in the next video, though, I will have to speed things on a little bit, not spend as much time filming and trying to get good footage, so for the one or two of you who watch, I'm sorry. Maybe what I'll have to do is just make a finale video that just kind of wraps it all up and gives you an idea of the steps I took. Maybe not, because it sounds like a lot of going back and editing old footage. Either way, this video ran much longer than intended and didn't seem nearly as productive as it could have. Either way, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting or informative or educational. And as always, if you've got questions, comments, suggestions, or whatever, leave them in the comments, drop me a message, follow me on Instagram and such, and catch me in the next video, which I will hopefully try and get out before next Sunday, but that's just kind of how my schedule's making things go right now. So, till then.